Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you my March reading wrap-up. I don't know about you guys, but March felt like the longest month of my life. But somehow I didn't really get that much reading done. I mean, I know how. Obviously this past month has been a little crazy. Life is not normal right now, and I have honestly had a lot of trouble focusing on reading because while reading is often an escape for me, sometimes I'm just not in the mood to read. I have been playing a lot of video games though. Anyways, I read a total of 4 things last month, which considering the circumstances, I am very happy with. I'm also very happy with the quality of what I read last month because my ratings were really good. I had 1 book that was 3 stars, 1 book that was 4 stars, and 2 books that were 5 stars. Out of these 4 books, 3 of them were a part of a series, so that was also really good. It will help my series percentage goal that I set at the beginning of the year. The 4 books that I read this month were Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Gottlieb, The Gilded Wolves, which is the first book in the Gilded Wolves series by Roshani Chokshi, Gideon the Ninth, which is the first book in the Locked Tome series by Tamsyn Miur, and Skyward by Sanderson, which is the first book in the Skyward series. I'll put timestamps in the description box for when I talk about each of these books, just in case you're only interested in hearing my thoughts on some of them. I will also link in the description box my reading vlogs that cover these books in case you want to see what my journey was while I was reading them. Alright, let's jump right into it. The first book that I finished was Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Gottlieb. This is a nonfiction memoir, so definitely not my typical kind of book, but I do occasionally pick these up, usually because I am reading them for my workbook club, and that was the case for this one as well. This was my workbook club book for March, and I really enjoyed this, like way more than I thought I would. And it actually was my favorite book that I read in March. That's how much I loved it, which, trust me, was a surprise because, I mean, it's not fantasy. So Gottlieb is a therapist, so this memoir, which actually isn't her first memoir, but I haven't read any of her other books, but this one is about her life as a therapist. So there are little stories about some of her patients that she was seeing, but also it's about when she was going through a really tough time in her life for various reasons, and she started seeing her own therapist, so it's also stories about her going to therapy. First of all, Gottlieb is just like a fascinating person. She's had such an interesting life. But I also just found so many nuggets of wisdom in this book. I forgot to mention, but I was reading this as a physical book. I had a hardcover out from my library. Even though it's a memoir, I did not listen to the audiobook. I couldn't access the audiobook for free, and the audiobook is not narrated by Gottlieb herself, although I have heard that the narrator for this book is really good. So maybe one day I will splurge and buy the audiobook because I love this book so much. Gottlieb explores a lot of different topics in this book, and it could be hard to read for some people. Some of the difficult subjects that I remember being covered were like terminal cancer in someone who's young, death of a child, a parent who is very ill, having a terminal illness. There's just a lot of tough subjects that are covered in this book, either through the therapy that she's providing for her clients or the therapy that she's receiving herself. I just found this book so fascinating. Not only is Gottlieb herself fascinating, but just her insights into the world as a therapist were so interesting and enlightening. There's just a lot about how people tick, how people deal with trauma and things like that that I found really interesting. I do have a bit of a background in psychology, and I'm sure that was one of the reasons why I found that stuff so interesting. I think this is a book that everybody should read because it just was that good, and I think it helps people to learn to be more empathic for others and understanding because you don't know what other people are going through. But I also think this is a really good book for people who have been to therapy themselves. I think they will find it really interesting, or also people who are interested in therapy or maybe have some misconceptions about therapy. I think this book would be really enlightening for people like that. I think I forgot to say it, but it has been on the screen this whole time. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. Like I said, I think it was my favorite thing that I read last month. The next book that I finished in March was The Gilded Wolves by Roshani. I had this book in all 3 formats. I was reading it primarily physically and on ebook, which I got out both from my library, but I also accessed the audiobook on Scribd for about the first 20% of the book before I decided I couldn't do it anymore. I really did not like the male narrator for this book. The book has 2 narrators, one female, one male. The female one I didn't have any issues with, but the male one I could not stand listening to him. He just narrates in a weird way that I didn't like. So I don't really recommend the audiobook, but obviously some people might not be as frustrated by his narration as I was. But also, the audiobook on Scribd is missing the prologue, which was really weird. This is a YA high fantasy. I was reading it because it was nominated for the BookTube SFF Awards. If you haven't heard about the BookTube SFF Awards or how I am judging the awards this year, I'm one of the many judges. I will link a video and some information about it down below. I was a little apprehensive going into this book because I honestly had heard not the greatest things about it, and I hadn't planned on reading it at all until it got nominated or made it to the shortlist for the awards. But it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it might be, which obviously a lot of people liked it if it made it onto the shortlist. So this is a heist story that takes place in 1890 in Paris, and the setting and the time period were some of my favorite parts about this book. This is when the World's Fair was happening in Paris. When I saw Roshani talk last month at the North Texas Teen Book Festival, she talked about this book a little bit, and it was funny because it was right as I was starting to read it. I was only a couple chapters in. But she said that the movie National Treasure was a really big inspiration for this book, and I can totally see that. While it is like a heist story, the characters are actually trying to find sort of historical artifacts, and there's all these clues and puzzles and stuff that they have to solve to be able to get to these things. And in that way, it reminded me a lot of National Treasure or Indiana Jones. But also the vibe I got or the tone of the book fit really well with those movies. And I found that the type of humor in the book was a little bit on the cheesy side, the kinds of jokes or the banter between characters was kind of cheesy in the way that I feel like those movies are. Also, this book had a lot of diversity. Even though it takes place in France, there are characters who have come to Paris from other places, and the colonialism of this time period is touched on just a little bit, which I know was something that Roshani mentioned when she was talking about this book. Not only is it ethnically diverse, but there's also diversity in sexual orientations, which I appreciated. I also really liked the magic in this book. It was so different and kind of cool, but I thought it was a blend of fantasy and sci-fi a little bit. They use their magic to create objects that can do things that we would typically consider to be technology. So for example, they use magic to create these little bugs that people can wear on the shirt that are recording devices, or they can create a device that does surveillance. Things that we would typically associate with technology, they are creating with magic, which I thought was really cool. That brings me to the things about this book that I did not like, and there were quite a few. None of them were really frustrating, but they all kind of added up together. One thing was related to the puzzles and the clues that I mentioned earlier. So these characters find clues and have to solve puzzles as they're looking for this thing that they're trying to steal. And the clues or the puzzles were always these weird random things. And honestly, I felt like they were solved super easily considering how random the clues were. Another thing that I found frustrating is the way some of the characters talked. There were some words that were used multiple times in the book that I didn't think were words that existed or were being used in that way back in 1890. The one example that I remember is there's a couple of instances where the word encrypted is used. And when I hear the word encrypted, I think very like modern, like computer technology kind of things. I don't know, it just really pulled me out of the story every time that happened, and it happened many times throughout the book. I just felt like the characters spoke in a very modern way. I also didn't fall in love with any of the characters. I usually love like a ragtag mix of characters that have like the whole found family thing going on, but for some reason I was not digging it in this book. I thought all the characters were interesting. They all had like interesting backstories and things like that, and I thought they were well fleshed out, but I just didn't love any of them, and they didn't totally come to life for me. There were also things about the pacing that were a little bit weird. There were some things that I felt like were happening off page that I wanted to be on page, like action things. And then there were some things that were on page that I didn't really care about and thought could have been off page. And so I just felt like the way the story was told was just a little bit weird for my taste. By the time I got to the end of this book, I had a lot of mixed feelings. There were definitely things that I thought were good and enjoyable about the book. It definitely started out really strong for me, and after about the halfway mark is kind of when things went a little downhill. All of these little things that I had been noticing started adding up towards the end of the book, and by the end I didn't enjoy it as much as I would have liked, and I ended up giving it a 3-star rating because I had such mixed feelings about it. Alright, the next book that I finished in March was Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Miur. This is the first book in the Locked Tomb series. This is another book that was shortlisted for the BookTube SFF Awards. I'm reading this for the science fiction category. So this is an adult science fiction book. Although I do say science fiction a little bit lightly, it is definitely a science fiction setting, but this is a genre-bending book, and it definitely feels much more like fantasy. And while I would think that is a recipe for amazingness for me, because I do love genre-bending books, it actually didn't work that great for me in this one for some reason. I just felt like instead of it being a seamless combination of two genres, it felt a little bit to me like the book was trying to do too many things at once. But I can totally see why everybody loves this book, and I did still enjoy it. I just didn't quite love it. So this book is pitched or described as necromancers in space, and I was so excited to find out more about how necromancers and space go together. And honestly, you don't really get too much of an explanation. It just kind of is. So the main character of the book is Gideon, who is a woman, which I didn't realize before starting the book. And she has grown up as a, like, servant, sort of the ninth house. But she's been trying to run away. Honestly, I don't know how to explain this book because it goes in, like, a million different directions. But she tries to run away at the beginning of the book and is unable to, but is convinced to go with this other character, a main character, to help her compete in a competition, and she's promised freedom if she does this. But the competition that they go to do is not quite what they thought it was going to be. It's definitely not what I thought it was going to be. So the setup for the story was really interesting, but it definitely went in a few directions that I was not expecting. The competition part of it I was excited about. I always love a good competition in books, but honestly it was not exactly a competition, or I mean it kind of was, but it kind of wasn't. If you've read the book, you know what I mean. But also, like, halfway through the book, it took a left turn. It turns into a little bit of a closed circle murder mystery, and that was, like, really weird for me. I think partially because it started so late in the story. While I thought that the magic in this book was interesting, it's necromancy, it's never really explained very well. There don't seem to be a lot of rules, or that's not true. I think there are rules because in the book, necromancy is treated more like a science. Like, there's theorems and people study it and things like that. So I do think that there are rules to it, but we just aren't given a lot of information about how it works or why it works or anything like that. I did like Gideon, the main character. She is very snarky, and some of the banter between her and the other characters was really funny, and so I really enjoyed her as a character. Honestly, my biggest complaint about this book is just that I was confused a lot. Part of it was confusion about the plot, like where was the story going, how does necromancy work, I need more information about the world. Why do we have a world that has spaceships and planets, but they're using swords and rapiers? I don't really understand that, and maybe those things will be answered at some point, but I definitely got the impression that I was just supposed to accept that this is how the world is. Not only was I confused about the plot, I was also confused about who everybody is. There are a lot of named characters in this book, and a lot of the named characters have multiple names, and they are referred to using different names throughout the book, and that was really confusing for me. It's actually one of my book pet peeves when authors have multiple names for characters and like go back and forth between them. If it's just like one or two characters, it's not that hard to keep track of, but when you have like 14 characters that have at least 2 names that they go by, like that's really confusing. There is a character list at the front of the book, and I referred to it often because I was actually doing a lot of this one on audiobook. I really like the audiobook narrator for this one, so I recommend the audiobook. The audiobook is on Scribd if you have a Scribd subscription. Luckily, I also had a physical copy of it from my library. So I did use the character list at the front of the physical book a lot, but I still was confused a lot of the time, like who everyone was, and just like trying to fix in my mind the different personality characteristics that go with each character, or how, you know, Gideon feels about all of the characters. I just had such a hard time keeping all of that straight. But despite all of that confusion, I still enjoyed my time reading it, and that's why I gave it a 4-star rating. I do think it is a like higher 3 that I've rounded up to 4, and not necessarily like a 4 on its own. I can definitely see why people really enjoy this book. It is unique, it's fresh, it's different, but there were just a few things about it that I struggled with that kept me from enjoying this even more. Alright, and then the last book that I finished in the month of March, I actually finished it on April 1st, but I'm definitely counting it for March, and that is Skyward by Brandon Sanderson, the first book in the Skyward series. This is another one that I was reading for the BookTube SFF Awards. This one specifically wasn't one of the shortlist nominees, but the sequel, Starsight, was, so I needed to read this first. It was one that I had planned to read eventually anyways. I am a Sanderson fan. I've read him before and enjoyed I think everything that I've read by him so far, so I had fairly high expectations. I was expecting to enjoy this book, and it totally lived up to my expectations, and I really loved it. This is a YA sci-fi about a girl named Spensa. This is set on a planet that has some humans on it who have landed there a few generations ago, and they have been at war with an alien species called the Krell for the whole time. The main character, Spensa, her dad was a pilot, and he is infamous for being a coward because there was a big battle at the beginning of the book, and apparently he ran away from the battle and was shot down for being a coward. And so Spensa has grown up under his shadow, being known as the coward's daughter. And all she wants to do is be a pilot like her dad, but the people who run the flight school and stuff don't want her to be a pilot because they're afraid that she's going to be a coward just like her dad. So that's the premise of the story. Spensa is obviously willing to do anything she can to be a pilot. So while I gave this book 5 stars, it definitely wasn't perfect. There were a few things that I didn't love about it. One of those being Spensa is kind of annoying, mostly at the beginning of the book. By the end of the book, she had grown on me a lot, and she had grown as a character a lot, which I think is what Brandon Sanderson's intent was. To be able to have a character that shows a lot of character growth, they have to start from a place of not already having that growth. So I did find Spensa frustrating, mostly because I felt like she was really immature. And that was another thing that bothered me about this book, is that a lot of it felt very middle grade, but it was also very YA at the same time. So I definitely think this is a really good book for younger readers who are transitioning between middle grade and YA. I think this would be a great transitional series. It is definitely a coming of age story, and in that way it fits really well with YA, but some of Spence's actions are very immature, and I don't know, a lot of it felt kind of middle grade, but also kind of YA, and that was weird. While I didn't love Spensa, I did really like some of the other characters in this book. Spensa has a male friend that is a platonic friend, which I always love seeing, but there's also an AI character that we're introduced to who is hilarious, and he or it was my favorite character out of the whole book. And there was also this little slug that was kind of like a pet in the book that I really enjoyed. For most of this book, I was thinking it was a solid 4-star read. I was having a good time, but I didn't love it. But the last quarter of the book changed my mind. The last quarter of the book was just so much fun. Sanderson, as always, is really great at endings. I actually thought that I could see where this ending was going, and I didn't think it was going to have some big surprise like Sanderson usually has at the end of his books, but it still had a bit of a surprise for me. A surprise that left me grinning, and I could not stop smiling for basically the whole last quarter of this book. It just was a lot of fun, and by the end of it, I couldn't deny that I loved it, and I had such a good time reading it. I am really excited to read the next book, which I should be doing shortly. Alright guys, those are the 4 books that I read in March. If you have read any of these books, let me know what you thought of them down in the comment section, or let me know what some of your favorite books that you read in March were. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye. You gonna say bye? Say bye-bye.